I get asked almost daily about pacifier recommendations, so I figured it was time to do a deep dive and start talking about it because I know this is a hot topic among both parents and professionals. Even different professionals who work with babies will have different recommendations based on the lens that they're looking through, given their educational background, but we'll get into that in a little bit. What I'd like to go over today is when to introduce a pacifier, and in the next parts of this series, we'll talk about what the research says about the benefits and risks of pacifier use, different pacifier options on the market, and my personal pacifier recommendation, and weaning from the pacifier. One of the most confusing things in my opinion regarding pacifier use is when is it okay to introduce a pacifier? If you're directly nursing, you've probably heard to wait until breastfeeding is well established, or sometimes breastfeeding specialists will say anywhere between 4 to 6 weeks, and I've even heard some breastfeeding specialists say not to introduce a pacifier at all. I also know that for a hospital to be considered baby friendly, they must not offer pacifiers unless requested, and even then, they're supposed to counsel the parents about the benefits and risks of pacifier use. I'm going to share a personal story here. When I had my baby last November and we were in the hospital, I had asked my nurse for a pacifier and she was very dismissive. It was a quick conversation. She kind of just shut it down and never said whether or not she was actually going to bring a pacifier back for us. But she did tell me that binkies are not recommended for babies who are learning to breastfeed. And obviously I know the reasoning behind that, but if you weren't in this field and your nurse who you trust says something along those lines, do you feel like you were given all of the information and allowed to make a decision? No, she never did bring one back for me, so I just asked the nurse tech next time she was in if she'd grab one for me, and she did, but then I felt like a criminal with contraband for wanting a binky for my baby. And again, it made me wonder if someone was in a similar situation who didn't know the benefits and risks of pacifier use, would they have even felt like they had a choice in that scenario, or felt confident enough to speak up and use their voice and ask for one again after being shut down? And then, what about after you get home? I feel like this is why parents get so confused, because they're trying to trust their intuition, but also listen to the one thing they were told by a medical professional, which is not to use a binky if you also want to breastfeed. And then you get on Google, and we all know how that ends. You're likely more confused than you were before. So let's go over the common concerns and negative beliefs about early pacifier introduction and what the research actually says. And spoiler alert here, I'm not going to give you a solid answer on when to introduce a pacifier. I'm going to give you all of the information and considerations so that you can make the best decision for you and your baby. Some people believe if a baby receives a pacifier, it will cause early weaning from breastfeeding. But the research has shown that that isn't true. Research has shown that breastfeeding rates are the exact same at 3 months postpartum, whether or not healthcare professionals caution against the use of pacifiers. There was a retrospective study done in Oregon State assessing whether or not removing the distribution of pacifiers in the mother-baby unit of a hospital made an impact on breastfeeding rates. And interestingly, they found that when they stopped offering families pacifiers, there was actually a lower rate of exclusively breastfed infants in the immediate newborn period. So this indicates that removing the options for parents to use pacifier with their newborns is not necessarily beneficial. Some people believe that offering a pacifier is going to cause nipple preference or confusion, resulting in poor breastfeeding outcomes, and this is still widely believed by many healthcare professionals, even though there is no scientific evidence to back this up. I personally do not believe that nipple confusion really exists. What I think is likely going on in these types of scenarios is there is probably some underlying breastfeeding difficulty that has not yet been identified, which results in an overuse of the pacifier. An example of this that immediately comes to mind is babies not effectively latching or removing milk, which means they may still actually be hungry, so they're showing feeding cues, but maybe they've been at breast for a while, so the parent reads this as baby has this need to non-nutritively suck, gives them their binky, and encourages them to go to sleep. Alternatively, babies really do need to suck to regulate their sensory system. So that's another potential explanation in this scenario. If you have a baby who you feel like really needs that pacifier and needs more of that extra oral sensory input, even though they are getting enough to eat. I Either way, if you feel like your baby may fall into this category of excessively using the pacifier, it may be helpful to see a lactation professional just to make sure that breastfeeding is going well. What I've gathered over my years of experience as both a feeding therapist working in a hospital and as a mother to 3, and after diving into what the research actually says about when to introduce a pacifier, is to basically do whatever makes the most sense for your family. I believe it's okay to introduce a pacifier once you feel confident that breastfeeding is going well. I don't think you need to wait the 4 to 6 weeks, but I also think that if you do introduce a pacifier early, you do so cautiously and sparingly, avoid offering the pacifier just because throughout the day, and be able to answer why you are offering one to your baby. There are very valid reasons for wanting to introduce a pacifier early, which we'll go over next, but you definitely don't want the pacifier to be taking place of bringing your milk in those first few days, or at a time when baby is truly hungry and seeking nutrition. So what would be considered ideal opportunities to use a pacifier? Number 1, to give the breastfeeding person a break if they're feeling touched out. Breastfeeding can be exhausting and all-consuming. I have been there. So if you feel like you just need a moment to step away, that is completely fine. Then come back when you feel a little bit more rejuvenated and you're ready to bond and nurse your baby again. If mom and baby are separated, for example, while driving, great time to offer a pacifier. The pacifier may be helpful if your baby has reflux. This is a whole nother deep dive that we need to get into, but sucking offers soothing for babies who are uncomfortable, and it also aids in digestion as well. Pacifiers can comfort baby during a painful procedure such as a heel prick, although directly nursing would actually be recommended if you can, but if it's a quick procedure, baby needs to be on a table or something, then a pacifier would be fine. Pacifiers are a great tool for stimulating the suck, swallow, breathe pattern needed for effective feeding in premature infants. I've spent some time working with premature infants in our NICU and with medically fragile and sick infants in the hospital, and more often than not, we do use pacifiers as a stepping stone to help babies learn the correct pattern for eating orally or in preparation to get back to eating orally. Pacifiers can help relieve ear pressure during airline travel, and sucking to sleep has been shown to reduce the risk of SIDS. This can be sucking at breast or bottle or non-nutritively sucking using the pacifier, and I will take this opportunity to note that it is not recommended to replace the pacifier if it comes out after baby has fallen asleep. Also, if you don't replace it after baby's fallen asleep, it gives them the opportunity to learn some self-soothing skills that don't involve the pacifier, which could help with future pacifier removal. When should you avoid a pacifier? Really, our goal here is to avoid overuse. So avoid using the pacifier immediately before a feed so you don't miss baby's feeding cues. Newborn babies eat very frequently at first to help bring your milk in, and their tummies are so small. So expect your baby to want to eat anywhere from every 1 to 3 hours. In general, you don't want to use a pacifier to space out feeds either, but I will say when babies have excessive reflux and they seem uncomfortable, it is sometimes necessary to use a pacifier because they only have one way to self-soothe. So they appear hungry even when they're not because they're uncomfortable from the reflux. And I understand this can be really tricky to figure out. So if you're questioning whether your baby is fussy or uncomfortable from reflux, you should ask your healthcare provider or see a lactation professional to help you out. And babies do have times when they cluster feed, where they eat for short bursts with short breaks in between, and it feels like they're feeding on and off forever. Cluster feeding happens for different reasons, including bringing your milk in during those early days. Sometimes in the evening when your milk supply is a little bit lower, it's just enough to satiate baby, so then they take a short break and come back for more. And also as they're going through a growth spurt, which is pretty much constantly. So this is why it's so important to understand how to tell if your baby has a good latch and if they're breastfeeding effectively. So I hope you can use this information you learned here to determine the right time to introduce a pacifier to your baby. The biggest takeaway for you out of all of this is for a healthy term newborn baby who is going directly to breast is really to make sure that breastfeeding is off to a good start first. And what this means is baby is latching without pain, you're hearing swallows while they're nursing, which kind of sound like a sound. Sometimes they do seem content after feeds and in between feeds, and they're having adequate wet and dirty diapers for their age, and if you're going to your pediatrician visits, they're growing well. Then just exercise your judgment and restraint around pacifier use, and avoid offering the pacifier at a time when your baby is content or playing well. And of course, there are other scenarios that I mentioned earlier where pacifier use would be okay and actually recommended. Next, we're going to go more in depth about the benefits and risks of pacifier use.